The dangerous socially accepted generalization that people of a certain age has more wisdom than the others allows people to be vulnerable to circumstances that put them in a precarious position. We think that age is just a number and has nothing to do with having good judgment and knowledge. The moment you assume that everyone of a certain age group is more wise than you make yourself vulnerable to abuse and exploitation, and you put yourself in precarious positions that can impact your life in the long term. A few points of case setup before I move on to the five topics. The first, what is this debate about? This debate is essentially a comparative analysis of whether or not the narrative that wisdom infuses with age brings more harm than good. The second case point of case setup here is that what do we prefer there on the outside of it? We prefer for the narrative about wisdom to not be dependent on age, but rather how people actually act, regardless. This means that people can be wise despite their age or unwise despite their age. And we prefer this as a narrative within society because it informs people in order for them to make the best decision for themselves, which I will do later on the next. There's a piece of framing before I move on to the next part. We would say that this debate is not about experience that comes with age, as people can experience things differently despite going through the exact same circumstances. We would say that experience is not wisdom, it's knowledge that comes with time and not because of time and not because of age. And the intuition part here is that it comes with time because the time just allows them to have a lot more life experience compared to the younger generation. But this doesn't necessarily mean that they are more wise because their experience might not be something that informs their decision making or even informs the advice that they impart to the younger generation. I think that old people who have a lot of life experience also aren't especially wise, they just have a lot more life experience. And even if this is not the case, that experience is not equal to wisdom, we would argue that it still does not detract from the fact that not everyone who is elderly is wise. I believe that some of the older generation still don't believe in science, despite all the unequivocal truth and the objective proof that it is real. Now, let's move on to arguments. Two arguments. The first, why the narrative that that wisdom comes with age puts the younger generation at a disadvantaged position to advocate for themselves and the issues that concerns them. The first level of fear is that we would argue that the younger generation are often unfairly viewed as immature, weak-willed, and ignorant. An example of this is often that younger generation are viewed as a generation that complains too much, for example, compared to the boomer generation who feels as if they've gone through hell in order to build their own life. And to use that as a reason to then explain or justify their opinions and values towards the younger generation that these are groups of individuals who don't have enough knowledge to guide their own life to make decisions that are long-termist in nature, to even make good decisions in their life. What does this consequently mean? This means that the opinions and issues that the younger generation centers or forward are viewed as less important issues and issues that are to be less prioritized by the political climate, for example. And these are issues that are important to the younger generation, i.e. climate change, for example, even that impact or it directly impacts their life within the near future, 5 to 10 years, for example. And it is the older generation who becomes the barrier to actual change when there's a general view within society that is stretched by this exact generation that makes you think that maybe there are other things that you should prioritize. When it can actually mean that the younger generation will have to live in for another 15 to 20 years, for example, will suffer in the long term. We will also say that this looks like talking about issues that concern access to tertiary education, for example, or allowing for individuals to have better access to tertiary education, which oftentimes becomes an issue that's less prioritized because of the fact that these are groups of individuals who are viewed as immature, weak-willed, and ignorant about the realities of it. I think that the argument that the government have better things to do, for example, compared to subsidizing tertiary education, when it directly impacts the livelihood of those individuals at the point of unable to access tertiary education and to have jobs with financial stability as a result of that. The comparative here is simple. We would say that um, if there's no general social acceptance that the elderly is absolutely going to be wise, people are more likely going to challenge traditionalist notions entrenched by the older generation, and people don't simply become slaves and become confined to the value system that they inherit from their parents or from the older generation. Now to the second argument. By the narrative makes people puts people in a vulnerable position and makes them vulnerable to abuse and exploitation. The first thing here is that the general assumption that the older generation has good judgment and knowledge makes people feel trusting of them and puts them on a higher pedestal compared to other groups of individuals, for example, because that we have wisdom or because that wisdom comes. I think that this leads individuals not being able to make their own judgment because of the preconceived notion that these groups of individuals are more wise or that they have more knowledge about life or that they would not act a certain way. I think that it impairs people's own judgment even when they know what is best for them. There are a few impacts of it. The first is that even in the best space that we are in opposition space, people just put more credence to the opinions of the elderly and it forces them to make sacrifices that they otherwise would not have done. For example, that they are advised to become a doctor or a lawyer to choose their career path, for example, and they are forced to take this because they feel as if that they should value the opinions and information that is given to them by the older generation. We would say that without this generalization, while people can still listen to the opinions of the parents or grandparents or uncles, whatever, about their career, they don't have to force themselves to become a doctor or a lawyer, or even feel like they failed their parents when they don't become. The worst case scenario here is we think that this is actually how people get it. It is the fact that we view the older generation as safe and it impairs their ability to make decisions that go against this entrenched belief that the older generation are safe. I think that without this generalization, children and teenagers can become more wary about adults who get uncomfortably close to them, and that they are more able to keep their boundaries up when they don't have the preconceived notion that this is not something that can be dealt with. All of this means that the narrative that uh, tells people that wisdom increases with age is something that's not just untrue, but also directly harms the lives of individuals.
Right. So, on the motion that reads, this house supports the narrative that wisdom increases with age. There are two arguments we're going to forward from government. The first thing is to say is that it increases or makes parent-child relationships comparatively better, point at which when this narrative kicks in, that is, it's then beneficial for the mental and physical well-being of the child. It just makes better parent-child relationships. The second argument is it gives you a positive outlook towards the future, which makes you make better decisions as an individual, gives you a mental safety net, but also means you can incrementally make progress towards your well-being. I think these are two large broad spheres under which we're gonna like support this motion. First thing is how does it support or make parent-child relationships comparatively better? The first thing to note here is point at which when there is an overarching narrative and the way this is likely to be played out is in society that the primary preemptive lens from which you're going to view societal discourse is through the lens or through the understanding that wisdom increases with age. This simply means that people who are elder in society, that is to say parents, maybe your teachers, they command a higher degree of respect, and that is and it would be generally presumed that they would know better about the world in general, and that is why you would normally take their advice into consideration, listen to them, and not like be a rebel and things like that. Why then empirically it is true that they are likely to be more knowledgeable. The first thing is probably they have seen life comparatively better. Parents have essentially gone through struggles that you probably not have experienced. This could either mean like ensuring that you are able to put food on the table during times of crisis. Say, for example, they have taken decisions that have sometimes essentially been risky, been able to manage personal and social commitments and professional commitments to essentially ensure that the child is essentially raised in a better manner and things like that. So they have made they have made tons of sacrifices. They've gone through life. They've seen a lot during essentially their tenure. The second thing is why they're likely to act in the best possible interest of the child, and this is important because probably side opposition can argue that parents might not always make good decisions. I think their intuitions are more likely to be honest and sincerely caring for the child. Of course, like there could be instances of child abuse, but we think those are in the minority of circumstances. The reason why, in the vast majority of instances, parents are likely to take good decisions is because one, it's an extension of your bloodline. You essentially feel it as a representation of yourself and as an extension of yourself and your identity. That's why you automatically would care for it comparatively more. Secondly, there's a lot of financial investment that you essentially put into this child in terms of its education, upbringing, healthcare, which means if the child does well, you also see this as a return on your investment, which means at that point of time, on a utilitarian calculus, also it's important for you to essentially ensure that the child succeeds. And thirdly, just from a moral lens, this is like a civilizational intuition that parents or the way human beings have evolved largely is to care for their future progenies to essentially ensure that, as I mentioned earlier, the bloodline continues and essentially there is like civilizational extension. So I think like this could be largely seen as like, say, for example, the mother's love for their child. So things like unconditional love are largely likely to be implicated, point at which, and we think this is largely like evolutionary mechanism that has happened over the years. With that being said, with that premise being correct, that parents are largely likely to make better decisions because of their kind of wealth of experience that they have, and secondly, they're likely to act in the best possible interest of the child. Why is that important? One, I think the problem under the present status quo is largely things like hedonism. This is to say, things like falling into vices that the outside world has to offer. Things like, say, overtly spending a lot of time on social media and ignoring, say, your academic assignments. Think of falling into addiction, such as things like smoking or alcohol. And these are like pertinent problems. Say, for example, underage smoking in the United Kingdom is a big deal, and that's why the government is like, say, for example, proposing measures to ban cigarettes, e-vapes, and things like that. I think teenagers who are largely impressionable, they're largely likely to be susceptible to fall into things like peer group pressures and things like that, which means to say the potential of individuals falling into hedonistic pleasures and vices are way more are consistently increasing because of advent of things like social media, things like peer pressure, and things like that. So in this circumstance, point at which when you trust your parents, I think you're more likely to essentially then not fall into these things because your parents are much more likely to guide you in a more positive manner, tell you to essentially not like mix with certain peer groups that they perceived essentially to be problematic, or say, for example, telling you to that you should focus on your academic assignments and not essentially fall into things like vices. I think in those circumstances, what happens on side opposition, I think when you do not trust your parents, you're much more likely to rebel against them. Perhaps you're likely to engage more in those vices and not take their advice seriously. On our side of the house, you're likely to take that advice seriously, not fall into things like hedonic pleasures. And that essentially ensures that you're able to progress better as an individual, but also means that when you trust your parents more, it just means that you're able to open up to them comparatively better. You're much more able to trust them on certain issues. You're much more likely to share things with them that are important to you. So this means that you build a better parent-child relationship when you put them at that pedestal, put them at that sense, give them that sense of respect, and that only happens when you essentially and inherently assume that wisdom, yeah, essentially comes with age. Which means on side opposition, probably there's going to be worse parent-child relationships because you're not likely to trust them and you're not likely to essentially listen to them. Which means to say, in those circumstances, we think things are going to get worse off. So on our side of the house, when there's a sense of trust and mutual respect, I think that's the point at which you have better parent-child relationship. The last part is simply to say that when you assume that wisdom increases with age. That is the point at which, when you're largely likely to have a more positive outlook towards life, you're likely to think, well, even if there are problems right now that I'm facing, I'd like to improve upon them, build upon them, and fix them in the future. And also, this means that individuals are more likely to make incremental progress and set milestones for themselves. Say, for example, make certain achievements or like get some level of professional goals and essentially assume that those things are going to be incrementally increasing over time once your wisdom increases decreases with time. So kind of gives you a positive outlook towards the future, which we think is incredibly important because it gives you things like optimism, things like a mental safety net that things will get better in the future when I become more knowledgeable. So which means individuals then have a greater positive outlook towards life, which we think is incredibly important. And when they essentially inherently assume that wisdom does increase with age. For all those reasons, side government.